Peace be with you this hour of this day as we gather in this loving assembly of family and friends to say goodbye to Bob Fearn. Together we gather to grieve Bob's dying and to celebrate Bob's living. Today we grieve Bob's death because he will not be a part of our lives as he once was. And we give thanks for the ways that his own life made our own lives richer. Let us shed tears if tears come, but let us also remember that each of us must express our own feelings of loss in our own ways and in our own times. Let us not be afraid of the depth of our feelings, no matter what these feelings may be, knowing they are a reflection of what Bob's life meant to our own. Let us also not be afraid to turn to one another at this time and in the days ahead, because we need each other in sympathy and consolation, and in courage and in wisdom to face Bob's death, to celebrate Bob's life, and to show our love and support for Bob's friends and family. I invite Jenny and Pamela up to light the chalice.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend. Hello, everyone, and thanks for being here today. It's nice to see everyone. I'm Pamela, not Tilla. The flaming chalice is the symbol of the Unitarian Universalist tradition in which this congregation stands. We light this chalice this morning to remind us that we are gathered in a time and space made sacred by our love and our grief, and made holy by our values, commitments, and the truths we hold and cherish as good and beautiful. Thank you, my darling. In the presence of death, we light the chalice because life is a miracle and nothing less than a miracle. That flowers bloom every spring, that living things beget living things, that we human beings emerge again and again from ignorance to knowledge, from hopelessness to meaning, from sadness to joy, from grief to gratitude. We light this chalice because we believe life is a miracle, and nothing less than a miracle.
Thank you, Pamela, Fearn, and Jenny. Jenny is Bob's granddaughter, and Pamela is his daughter-in-law. Anyone that knew Bob knew that he loved to tell tales. In that spirit, today, Bob's children will share tales of Bob, starting with Diane Fearn DeRocher.
Good morning. As introduced, I'm Diane, Bob's oldest. Yes, that would be the 6-month-old who stood on her mother's lap and shouted "truck" at every passing vehicle from Pullman, Washington to Duxbury, Massachusetts. After that adventure, I am amazed that Mom and Dad had any more children, but thankfully for me, they did. So when we four sat down to discuss how to celebrate our father, we asked ourselves, what do you remember, what do you cherish from our childhood, and what was important to him? One of the things that all of us popped up with was the fact that he would read to us at bedtime. And he read from this. This is the Childcraft Encyclopedia, and there were a couple of books that he read over and over again. So I'm going to read you a few of them. Not the whole poem, just a few stanzas. They were short, silly poems to make us giggle. There were dramatic ones, and I found when I read back through them all that I still hear them in his voice. Let's start with a little bit of fun. I never saw a purple cow. I hope I never see one, but I can tell you anyhow, I'd rather see than be one. Or, if all the world were apple pie, and all the seas were ink, and all the trees were bread and cheese, what would we have to drink? And then in celebration of Dad's love of the wilderness, by the shores of Gitche Gumee, by the shining big sea water, stood the wigwam of Nokomis, daughter of the moon, Nokomis. Dark behind it rose the forest, rose the black and gloomy pine trees. And he taught us a love of history with things like, listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. 'Twas the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is still alive who remembers that famous day and year. And another funny one with a subtext that I really didn't recognize until I read it this week. You are old, Father William, the young man said, and your hair has become very white, and yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think at your age it is right? And the subtext is, Dad's father was William Fearn, and he was almost 60 years old the day his 17-year-old went off to join the Army just following World War II. And I think that was the thing that he found amusing about the poem that none of us picked up on. And one final poem, which doesn't come from the Childcraft books, but Dad learned it by heart, as children did in those days, at a very young age. Under the spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. The smith with a mighty man was he, with broad and sinewy hands. And the muscles in his brawny arms were thick as iron bands. Dad's grandfather, Thomas Morecambe Bray, was a blacksmith, and Dad visited his forge as a boy. So, when you go downstairs, we have some pictures set up. One of them on the display is the wedding picture from William and Violet Fearn, our grandparents. And in that picture, if you look all the way to the right, is the village smith, our great-grandfather. There are 4 other grandchildren of Thomas Bray, great-grandchildren of Thomas Bray. 2 of them are here with us tonight. We have Harriet and Bonnie. We call them, the 4 of them, their 2 siblings are here with us virtually. We call them, internally, we call them the Skeenses. Harriet's husband, Mike, is also with us, and we thank you so much for making the trip down. It's a long way to come for a service, and we are so glad that you were here. And looking out at my cousins who could not make the trip, we miss you, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Good morning. I'm the short one. I'm Debbie. Oh, I don't need to stand up. I think. Oh, she's going to give me a step up. Wow. Look at that. Oh, I'm number 2, and my older sister spoke for me until I was 3 years old. I didn't even say a word until I was 3 because she talked for me all the time. So today, as well as reading stories before bedtime every night, Dad kept us entertained on family road trips. He had a wonderful singing voice, and he taught us silly songs like "Be Kind to Your Web-Footed Friends" and "The Bear Went Over the Mountain." At home, he was often at the stereo playing favorite classical music, big band tunes, and musicals. Many times I remember dancing on his feet. Today, I want to share a couple of stories that Dad included in his book. I hope these stories will illustrate what drove him to live his life to the fullest and to make a difference. I'm going to start with a story that is entitled Drugs and TV. I'm going to share the drugs part, not the TV part. So these are Dad's words, and as Diane said, when he read stories to us, we often heard his voice. I hear his voice every time I read his stories from his personal books that he wrote for the kids, so that we have a legacy to remember him by. Pharmaceuticals were among the other products to which residents of northern New Jersey had early access. During my boyhood and until the 1960s, New Jersey and Indianapolis, Indiana, were the 2 major centers of what we always called the drug industry. That ease of access is crucial to this story because at age 13 I contracted pneumonia, a dread disease that had killed my oldest sister Harriet a year or so earlier. I was running a fever of 106 degrees Fahrenheit, and nothing my father, my mother, a registered nurse, or a family doctor succeeded in breaking the fever. The prospect of my demise was terrible for my parents to contemplate, all the more because of Harriet's recent death. My mother, in particular, never quite recovered from Harriet's death, an event that shook her confidence in life and her deep religious faith. It was clear to all that I would not survive unless the fever was broken, and soon. Faced with the prospect of losing the second of their children to pneumonia, Dad and Mom agreed to experiment with a new, completely untested drug, an early form of sulfa drugs. I believe that they and Doc Lucent, an old family friend, perhaps with the assistance of the pharmaceuticals company, estimated the dosage needed by the comparison of my body weight and those of the experimental animals. If my memory serves, those animals were mice. After the drug was administered, I experienced a touch-and-go period, after which the fever broke and I began to recover. I owe my life to the drug, to the willingness of my parents and Doc Lucent to experiment, and very likely to the proximity of the pharmaceutical industry. Afterwards, I talked to my mother about the nightmares I had during that crucial period, and she assured me that the nightmares and hallucinations often accompany high fevers. I insisted that those dreams were unlike any I had ever had, but she admonished me and said that they were water over the dam or something similar. It was not until 30 or 40 years later that I understood what I experienced. I was watching the color TV show on which an artist was demonstrating what he had experienced under LSD. The blood coursing through the arteries and veins, the bright and pastel shades, etc. And I knew that I had been there. I had experienced one of the first bad trips, but it had saved my life. Small probabilities. As the bad trip story indicates, I nearly did not survive to adulthood. Pris experienced an equally traumatic event. During the mid-1930s, the Southard family lived on Martha's Vineyard, where Pris's dad, Guy Southard, ran a grocery store at Oak Bluffs. The family lived in one of the charming cottages that surround the tabernacle at the old campground. Priscilla, nicknamed Prill by her family, was hit by a car as she ran out of the alley behind the house. The probability of that accident actually happening was minute, but it happened. She was taken to the nearby Martha's Vineyard Hospital. Pris was not expected to live, and even after her recovery, there were questions about her ability to bear children upon maturity. But Pris recovered and subsequently married a man whose life as a child had been saved by an early form of the sulfa drugs. Their 4 children and 5 grandchildren, as of this date, owe their existence to the unlikely recoveries of both Chris and Bob. I leave the precise calculation of those probabilities to someone wiser and less biased than I, but I suspect the odds against both Chris and Bob surviving, marrying, and having live and healthy children are astronomical. We're very thankful that they both survived and that we were born. One more little part that I'd like to read to you illustrates my dad's thoughts about life and how life progressed for him and what his feeling was that he wanted to do with his life or maybe give back for the gift that he was given. One of the more important influences during my childhood and youth was the Community Methodist Episcopal Church. I regularly attended Sunday school and lots of church functions. In addition, the Boy Scout troop was at and sponsored by the church. The minister, Reverend Rohrbach, made it quite clear that the essence of religion was good works and that salvation depended on one's record here on earth. As social action Methodists, he and his parishioners sought to identify and remedy social ills, of which there were many during the 1930s. Reverend Rohrbach also bred and grew gorgeous irises, but I was more impressed by the library in the parsonage and by the life of the mind suggested by all those books. Clearly, the library, Reverend Rohrbach, and the entire church experience communicated a strong message that knowledge was to be used for the betterment of the human condition. It had a strong influence on me and on lots of others in my small hometown. And I would just have to say that that is the biggest influence I think my dad had on all of us, that we want to work for the common good and would like to see everyone have a better life because of it. And we were extremely blessed to have my dad as a father, and we were equally blessed to be the children of both Bob and Priscilla Fearn.
Morning, class. I'm Robbie Fearn, filling in for Bob Fearn today. You may notice some resemblance. My dad, our dad, loved music. Our house was filled with songs from Carousel, South Pacific, My Fair Lady. You never knew what you would hear. He would whistle, he would hum to his last moment. He was humming. And he also loved poetry. He loved dance. In fact, our parents met when Dad snuck in through the basement kitchen window to a closed dance at Boston University, where he and Mom ended up dancing the night away. So those were the things that Dad loved. But Dad loved more than anything a good story. And not just a good story he was telling. In fact, we have this thing where, like, if you're in a group of people having a conversation and Dad starts a story and the conversation goes another direction, 30 minutes later, Dad will find a way of coming back and finishing that story because he thinks it's very important for you to know that story. So I'm going to tell you a very quick story from Dad's youth, probably one of his first stories. Do you know the one about the toity-doity purple boys? Just see, there was these toity-doity purple boys, and they was sitting on the coib, eating worms, boiping and coicing. Now along comes Goit, Goit the girl with coils, and her boyfriend Oiby, the boy with boils. And they saw them toity-doity purple boys sitting on the coib, eating worms, boiping and coicing, and they was patoibed. Now wouldn't you be, huh? So that's a story from Dad's childhood. Dad grew up in northern New Jersey near the Great Falls of the Passaic, place where America's Industrial Revolution began, where early unionization happened. And he lived amongst the Van Dusens, the Van Dykes, the Roosevelts, and he thought everyone in the world lived amongst the Van Dykes, the Van Duysens, and the Roosevelts. Dad grew up in a Dutch ghetto. Now, Dad defined a ghetto as a place of limited experience and limited opportunity. And it didn't matter. Everyone grows up in their own ghetto. Whether you're growing up in Harlem, in Mombasa, on a farm in Kansas, you grew up in your own ghetto. Well, Dad wanted to get out of his ghetto. Dad wanted to serve, as Debbie said. He wanted to see how others lived their life, what lifted them up, what caused them to work with others, to unionize, in essence. What did they discover outside their ghetto? As an economist, Dad was a social scientist, and he said he kind of had much help to get to the numbers part, which I have a really hard time believing, because if you went into that old round building on campus, I don't remember what hall that was, and you looked at his blackboard, there were no numbers. It was all letters and little formulae that I could never understand. But he said it was the social part that drew him to economics. Because economics is actually, eco is home, nomics is numbers, so it's the study of the numbers of home. He wanted to understand how financial structures affected people's lives. What did they do with money that allowed them to either be lifted up? What did our culture do with money that pushed them down? So in that process, he learned to value hard work, setting high standards, developing the intellect, the life of the mind. He developed a family which is mostly processes everything neck up. We're all up here most of the time. But Dad discovered a lot through traveling when he got himself out of his ghetto. And then he would share these stories, because these stories to Dad were like little jewels, like little treasured bits of wisdom, of perception, of wit, of insight. And he had a sheer childlike joy in sharing that discovery as a tool to improve your life, and also to hear himself talk. Let's be honest about it. Dad loved that. So it didn't matter whether he was telling you a story about going to midnight mass on a tiny Greek island with the head of the Greek Communist Party and saying to him, "Why are you going to mass?" And having the gentleman go, "Well, I'm Greek first." Or whether the story was about him talking to his new boss at this southern university who he had moved to, who'd taken him out to lunch, at which point Dad said, "Well, barbecue's okay, but I don't think it's going to catch on." Or what it was like to be a young CIA analyst and walk into CIA headquarters with a vintage Civil War Henry rifle, and what happens when you do that. Or as an 86-year-old, what it's like to stand on the bridge of a ship crossing the Drake Passage near Antarctica to see your final continent while the waves crash over the lower decks. Or even trying to bribe the Russian guards at the border between the Ukraine and Belarus with cigarettes when all the guards really want is vodka. Those were the sort of stories that Dad loved to tell, particularly the international stories, because internationalism was really core to Dad's work. He supported so many students from all over the year. He was not of a time that saw the other as a threat. He was of a time that saw the other as our way to a more unified future. So we rarely had a Thanksgiving dinner at the Fearns house that did not have 2 or 3 international students at it. They were always there at that table because it was our way, Dad's way, of sharing our traditions with them. And the Fearn dinner table was a thing. I mean, it was a thing. At that table, all of us We're trained to set our minds to a task, to strive to be competent at everything we did. We were all taught to think for ourselves, and most importantly, no matter what you thought, you needed to be able to defend your position. These were all tools. These lessons were tools for us to learn to be productive, to learn to help lift others up. So I'm going to tell you one last story that Dad used to love to share about Mom, because I think it showed part of the reason he loved her so much. This tale takes place in the wild and exotic land of Ohio. Picture very poor newlyweds living in a tiny trailer in a campground where they have to walk to the bathroom every morning or in the middle of the night. Well, Mom worked at a cafeteria, and the owner of the cafeteria would make this big to-do in the community about the fact that he would serve dinners to the orphans in the community. But what Mom learned working there was before the orphans came, the staff had to take all the good stuff off the buffet and serve tiny portions, including taking the roast beef away. So the owner offers Mom a job slicing the roast beef. This is here's a 5-cent raise. You're going to slice the roast beef as long as you can learn to slice it as thin as possible. Now, this was exactly opposite of what Mom believed, and so she quit. Their belief in caring for others was greater than their poverty. And that, I think, is one of the reasons Dad loved Mom so much. They were an amazing team for decades. I can see them now dancing together to the strains of Glenn Miller. That will stay in my mind forever. So now to finish, remembering that Bob was an award-winning teacher, a firm professor, lifting up his students. This is in the spirit and actually the structure of his final exams in economics. I need you all to get out your composition books. Oh, unprepared are we? All right, well, there will be 3 questions. All of the questions will be about cultural exchange, hard work, financial structures, human capital, the betterment of other people's lives, and each question has one of 3 possible answers: true, false, uncertain. Defend your answer. Dad had a very, very long life and a very, very fascinating path and a fascinating story, taking him from the toity-doity Purple Boyd's ghetto to being a global traveler, a well-respected and beloved father, teacher, and storyteller. Well done, Dad. Well done.
Hi, I'm Tilla. Thanks for being here. I'm Bob's youngest daughter. Not the youngest child, you just met him, if you didn't know him already. It's a good thing he was younger, because he's a tough act to follow. Not that the other 2 weren't too, but that's the way it goes in a big family. Those of you who had the opportunity over the years to spend even a little bit of time with Dad probably figured out pretty quickly that the man liked people. And the only thing he liked better than people was talking to people. Okay, maybe traveling too, but that's another story. Over the years, our family spent what probably totals years waiting while Dad laughed and conversed with someone. At rest areas and gas stations, at the pool, on the sidewalk, wherever we were, in the checkout line, at the grocery store, in campgrounds, and even in the Russian embassy in DC. Dad never passed up an opportunity to chat, and in fact, he was usually the instigator. Some of you may have experienced that. A common long-suffering refrain expressed by each of our kids at one time or another was, "Mom, Dad's talking to someone again." We all knew we'd move on when Dad was good and ready. As much as Dad loved an audience, speaking, with family and friends, he took special delight in talking to strangers. Meeting people, learning about them, their family origins and nationalities, their native languages, what they do for a living, where they go to school, and where they live, in short, their stories. And almost always sharing a story of his own, forging connections. Along the way, some of these connections with strangers were brief, no less rewarding, just brief. Other strangers became friends. Dad had friends all over the world and right in his own backyard, people who greatly enriched his life and people who believed he enriched theirs. In his later years, especially after Dad stopped driving, it became more difficult for him to meet people. So those he did meet became even more important to Dad and by extension to our family. Dad's neighbors here in Raleigh, in Lakeview, are wonderful people. Sherry and Hamid next door, Stephanie and her family across the street, Marcia down the block, and so many others never failed to check on Dad, stopped to chat with him at the mailbox, listen to him share his experiences and his stories, or give me a call if they were concerned. We are forever grateful for that. It allowed Dad to live his whole life without having to go into a facility, which was something he really did not want. And those people made a big difference. After our mom passed 13 years ago, Dad had long since retired from NC State and was no longer doing consulting, and he was a bit at loose ends. So after decades away, he returned to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Raleigh, where we had attended as a family during our early years in Raleigh. This congregation welcomed him and expanded his community overnight. He looked forward all week to the music, thought-provoking services, and probably most of all, the social hour following the service. No surprise there. A cup of tea, a few cookies, and conversation made him happy. The fellowship even surprised him with a cake to celebrate his 97th birthday. He was thrilled. An invitation to share a selection of his travel photos and memorabilia here with the congregation made him feel relevant. A ride to a Wednesday night dinner, visits from members of the care committee who would drive him to the bank or grocery store or out to lunch, including one memorably chilly top-down drive to the Shiny Diner for lunch in Chris McPherson's convertible, which Chris sent me a video of. It was entertaining. Community, when Dad needed it. We thank this congregation for giving him that. We also give thanks to Reverend James and to all the good people at Heartland Hospice that treated Dad with dignity, kindness, and respect at the end, helping us help him write his final chapter his way. He may no longer be here with us, but his stories live on. I'd like to close with a short quote which I believe expresses Dad's underlying commitment to a world where everyone is accepted, embraced, and celebrated. This quote is from Annie DeFranco, who is a Canadian-American singer-songwriter, author, and an activist. I know there is strength in the differences between us. I know there is comfort in the overlap. Thank you. It's difficult enough to capture the life and the legacy of anyone who has lived over 97 years within a 10-minute eulogy. If that person is Dr. Robert M. Fearn, the task is nearly impossible. Luckily, Bob, as most called him, was a prolific writer and left many books and papers, letters, and memoirs behind, leaving a great gift to academia, to colleagues, to mentees, and most importantly, to those who loved him the most. Bob's children shared some of these writings earlier. I wonder how many of these writings would have been possible without the partnership with his wife of nearly 62 years, Priscilla, or Pris as he called her. For Pris was his proofreader to correct his terrible spelling, and his typist, transforming his abysmal writing into words the world could read. The two met at Boston University and bonded over things like love of travel and adventure and education, and having both tragically lost teenage siblings. The couple married in 1951, and they lived together in a student trailer park while Bob finished up his bachelor's degree at Ohio University. Bob and Priscilla would often refer to the contract they made with each other. That Priscilla would raise the kids and keep the home, and that Bob would pursue his academic career. Sometimes they joked about the contract, but they took it seriously. Bob had many professions in his life, everything from being a dishwasher and a lifeguard to being a CIA analyst, but it was in his work as a professor that Bob found his true vocation, work that has affected countless other academics, professionals, and students. And the contract he made with Priscilla made that possible. While it wasn't always easy, money was tight, especially in the beginning. But through the years, their partnership and their family grew, and Bob earned his master's degree, worked with the CIA, and eventually completed his PhD in labor economics at University of Chicago. And through Bob's many fulfilling years as a professor and so much more at North Carolina State University, Bob and Priscilla's contract created for Bob both a rich professional and personal life. Bob had an intellectual curiosity from an early age and highly valued education. And while Bob could be an absent-minded professor, focusing so closely on what he was doing that he could be completely clueless to what was even happening around him, but he was also genuinely interested, even fascinated about other people, all kinds of people. Bob didn't care what you believed in as long as you could articulate and defend your position. In one of Bob's writings about education, he writes, "Education is best seen as a process through which the individual is freed from the limitations of his or her culture. Via education, the individual becomes capable of judging the worth of received values, ideas, and institutions, as well as the worth of those from other cultures." Bob saw education not just a process of learning about certain topics or disciplines, how things are, but also about how things were in other places and how things could be. He felt that education and knowledge would lead to a better world. Bob's children described their home growing up as a refuge for all kinds of people, a place truly welcome to all. Bob's way of talking with people and his love for travel, his CIA work, his consulting in other countries after he retired, all of this was part of his education and allowed him to envision and work towards a better world. Perhaps something he learned from being part of the Methodist Church as a youngster, or an outgrowth of his natural curiosity about others and seeing all as worthy of dignity and respect. Bob felt strongly in the importance of being of service to others. In his writing about public service, he writes, "It's my belief that everyone who is well educated and or is privileged to be a university professor has a moral obligation to be of service to the general public. I think of that service as a way of paying one's debt to society, whose many fruits we professors enjoy." Having a keen interest in politics at a young age, soon after Bob and Priscilla and his family arrived in Raleigh, they both set to work towards social change. They noticed that the city government selection process favored councils built of long-time Raleigh residents, well-known politicians and successful businessmen, often all from the same neighborhood, while the interests of the city's Black and poor and recent arrivals went unheard and unaddressed. So Bob and Priscilla helped create the West Raleigh Civic Association with other members from the city, the very ones who had been excluded from the city council table. And through skillful political strategy and community organizing, this group was able to democratize the Raleigh City Council selection process, which led to the election of the first and only Black mayor in Raleigh, Clarence Leitner, as well as distributing affordable housing throughout the city rather than concentrating it in one neighborhood. While Bob's children were growing up, he spent a lot of time building his career and his civic engagement. And as is common, each child had a different experience of growing up in the Fearn family. But his children share fond memories of story time, of the soundtrack of their childhood consisting of Vivaldi's Four Seasons and show tunes, and of Bob practicing his Russian and his Greek. They talk of going for swims at Carmichael Center in the winter and how much of a treat that felt like as they walked back with wet hair in the cold air. They remember cooking stews in rest areas on long summer camping trips. Bob lived his philosophy of to each according to their needs. Bob and Priscilla raised each of their 4 children to be who they were and supported whatever interests and gifts led each of them towards. Dr. Robert M. Fearn leaves behind as a legacy countless people from across the globe whose careers were launched through his mentorship and guidance and natural curiosity. Part of Bob's legacy is his civic activism. Some of the changes that he helped make remain in place today. Part of Bob's legacy is through the ripples of how he believed that education could lead to a better world. Brilliant mathematician and economist, savvy community organizer, devoted teacher, impassioned world traveler, loving husband, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, brother, storyteller. These are just some of the words and phrases that describe the many parts of the man who was Bob Fearn. For all of this and so much more, Bob was loved. For all of this and so much more, Bob will be deeply missed. I invite you to stand as you are able as we sing together hymn number 38, Morning Has Broken. These words will be displayed on the screen and can also be found in your gray hymnal. Please be seated. We now welcome Chris McPherson up to share some memories of Bob.
Hi everyone, my name's Chris, and I'm so honored to have called Bob my friend, and this has been one of the most incredible celebrations of life that I've ever been to, and it just gives incredible honor to Bob to hear his children and his friends speak today about what an incredible man he was. I met Bob here a couple of years ago downstairs in coffee hour, and in typical Bob fashion, he was engaging with everyone, and we became fast friends. If Bob was here, I sought him out and tried to have conversations with him. We enjoyed really speaking and connecting with each other, and it was just always something that I looked forward to when I came to UUFR. Bob had some incredible qualities, and it was the combination of those qualities that really stood out to me. He was smart, knowledgeable, and worldly, but he was also warm, approachable, and curious about life. And it was that combination that made Bob such a joy to be around. Bob lived life with style. He really carried himself with dignity, class, but never with ego. He was always a person that, as has been said, would speak with anyone, and I really appreciated that about Bob. One of the greatest honors that Bob gave to me was to ask me to visit him at his home, and we've met a few times. And during those visits, we would talk about so many things. As it's been stated here, Bob was extremely worldly, and we would talk about all of his adventures. He would tell his stories around Russia, China, Peru, his time hiking in North Carolina, his love of his family and nature, the times that he spent with his family in the Outer Banks. He was always so interesting, and he was always just so well-spoken and incredibly educated. I once said to Bob, Bob, you've been to so many schools, you've got so many degrees, that I've come up with a mnemonic way of remembering all of the places that you've studied at. And I said, BOWOC, NC. And he got such a kick out of that because it was Boston University, Ohio University, Washington State University, American University, and University of Chicago, where he studied under Milton Friedman and then was a professor at NC State. He was incredibly accomplished. And it was such a joy. I'd always leave his house or with conversations with him feeling smarter, energized, and just happier altogether. Bob really lived his life with his family at the center. He was very proud of his children, and it's obvious to see why from what's been stated today, what's been spoken about by his family. He was an incredible family man with family at the center. One of my favorite memories of Bob was driving in my convertible with him to the Shiny Diner. And we were listening to, it was a warm, sunny day in November, and we were listening to Glenn Miller, which I didn't know that he was such a fan of, actually. I put that on, and I looked over at Bob, and the wind was blowing on both of us, and he had this incredible Greek fisherman hat on, swaying to the music. And it felt like we were transported to another time. And it was just such a beautiful memory that I'll always carry with me of spending that time together with him in that simple moment. It's been stated in the obituary, which was just beautifully written and captured Bob so well, that Bob never met a stranger. And that is certainly the case. He loved talking to everybody. And I'm just so incredibly thankful that our paths crossed and that I was able to call Bob a friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to open up this space for anyone else who has a short memory they would like to share.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about a different Bob Fearn. A Bob Fearn that I knew from the time I was 8 years old. He and my sister Priscilla were at BU together. And we got a call that she was bringing her new boyfriend home. And that it was exciting because he thought he had some, quote, Indian blood in him. Well, I was so excited because I was a cowboy and Indian girl. And I was expecting this guy to come and he was going to be dressed in buckskin and just going to be this wonderful cowboy. And in walks this handsome guy in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt and no buckskin anywhere. And I thought, that's funny. Then he opened his mouth and started talking, and I couldn't understand a word he said. I was like, and I thought, well, maybe that's Indian. So I wasn't quite sure what was going on there. And he had his sister Barbara with him. And they were staying for the day. I guess she'd been visiting him at BU. And my brother Ronnie, who was 17 at the time, was really interested. And as my mother would have said, boy, is he smitten on her. Well, they all started talking about going to the beach at night to see the submarine races. And I'm like, there are no submarines at Duxbury Beach. What in heaven's name are they talking about? And what I didn't know was that that was the local jargon for parking at the beach, was to go and see the submarine races. So that was my first meeting with Bob. I never, ever called him my brother-in-law. To me, he was a brother. And he was someone who was there when I needed him. They took me to their cottage with them the summer after Ronnie was killed and kept me there, even though they'd only been married a short time. And a woman drowned while I was there, and he was teaching me to swim. And every single night, even though he'd been diving every day, he made me. He had to drag me screaming into the water because I was terrified. But by the end of the month that I spent with them, he had me gladly swimming again. But the story I like the best is between him and my mother. the first time that he came to the house, we were in the house, and he handed my mother a small bottle of wine as a hostess gift. And she thanked him very profusely and handed it back to him and said, "I allow no alcohol in this house. It's a non-alcoholic house, but thank you for the thought." Well, Bob wasn't going to let her get away with that. So the next time he came, he didn't give her a bottle of alcohol, and we were in the house, and she left the kitchen to go to the bathroom. And he turned around, and he reached down in his pants, and he had taped a little bottle of alcohol on his thigh, and he pulled it out, and he put it on the counter. And she walked out into the kitchen, and there's a bottle of alcohol. And she looked at him, and she said, "I thought I told you no alcohol." And he looked at her just as straight and said, "Oh, gee, I didn't remember you saying that." And the next year, he hid it in, the girls were little, and one of them had a doll with a fluffy dress, and he hid it in the doll's dress, and there was the alcohol. Another year, he cut a hole and cut all the pages out of a book and put the alcohol in there, and it showed up on the counter. And finally, one day, my mother said to him, "Truce?" And Bob looked at her and said, "Okay, truce." And that was the end of the alcohol. But it had become a game for both of them, because he would come in and she'd even pat him down to see if he had any alcohol on him. And he didn't. But the last thing that I remember about Bob, I had gotten divorced, and I had a 6-month-old son. And I was living with my parents, and they were babysitting him, and they were well into their 60s. And the day after Christmas, he came up to me, and he said, "Ellie, you can't live here anymore." And I said, "What do you mean I can't live here anymore?" He said, "Take a look at your parents. They're exhausted." He said, "They are just at the point of exhaustion, and you're going to lose them if you have them keep on taking care of the baby." And I said, well, and I had been moping around after work and letting them take care of him at night, too. And he said, "You need to get an apartment." And I said, "I can't afford an apartment." And he said, "Yes, you can." The next morning at 7:30, there's a knock on my door, and it's Bob, and he said, "Come on, get dressed." And I said, "What for?" And he said, "We're going apartment hunting." And he spent the day with me, and we must have seen 25 apartments until we found one that I could afford, and I could move out. And we got home, and they were there for Christmas to have fun. The kids were little. And the next day, he called all my brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and I don't know who else, and got them all to donate furniture so that I'd have furniture in the apartment. And that's my last recall as a really young person of Bob. I remember all his stories. I remember him with the kids, and I remember him with everything. But I remember him mostly with helping to save my life, because he gave my life back to me. Once I got into that apartment, I had to function as a human being again. And so, as I said, when I think of Bob Fearn, I don't say Bob Fearn, my brother-in-law. I say Bob Fearn, my brother. Thank you.
we have time for one more short memory if anyone would like to share one. Hearing none, I hope you will share generously your stories during the reception that will follow. And now we would like to share some pictorial remembrances with you. I invite us all to be together in a time of shared stillness and silence. During this time of stillness and silence, let us reflect on what our own lives meant to Bob and what Bob's life meant and continues to mean to us. Following the service, I invite everyone to join us downstairs for a reception in Founders Hall. But now it is time for us to prepare ourselves for the leaving. We give thanks for the life of Bob Fearn. We give thanks that he lived. We give thanks for the ways that he made our own lives fuller and this world a better place to live. We hold in our hearts those who loved Bob the most and feel his loss the most acutely. We pray that in the coming days life may grant them acceptance and peace. Our postlude will be a recording of a song beloved by Bob, The Parting Glass. We won't be able to include the song in the stream for those who are joining remotely, so I would like to read the lyrics from the song now. Of all the money that e'er I had, I spent it in good company. And all the harm I've ever done, alas, it was to none but me. And all I've done for want of wit, to memory now I can't recall. So fill to me a parting glass. Good night and joy be to you all. So fill to me the parting glass and drink a health whate'er befall. And gently rise and gently call. Good night and joy be to you all. Of all the comrades that e'er I had, they're sorry for my going away, and all the sweethearts that e'er I had, they'd wish me one more day to stay. But since it fell unto my lot that I should rise and you should not, I gently rise and softly call. Good night and joy to be to you all. A man may drink and not be drunk. A man may fight and not be slain. A man may court a pretty girl and perhaps be welcomed back again. But since it has so ought to be by a time to rise and a time to fall, come fill to me the parting glass. Good night and joy be with you all. Good night and joy be with you all. As we leave this place, may we do so with ever more love for one another, with ever more awe and gratitude for this precious gift of life we share this very day, with ever more peace in our hearts, and with ever more hope for this world we share. Amen.